3 in the morning, standing in our living room, and my wife just destroyed 10 years of marriage with one sentence. She didn't ask, didn't apologize, didn't even look me in the eye when she said she's done sleeping with me and I need to deal with it. The crazy thing is, I'm not crying or yelling or begging her to reconsider. Instead, something ice cold clicks into place in my chest, and I realize I've been waiting for this moment without knowing it. This isn't a story about fighting for love or second chances. This is about what happens when a man stops being a fool and starts being dangerous. The house in Greenwood was supposed to be our crowning achievement. Lauren and I bought this place 6 years ago when we were still pretending to be the perfect suburban couple. White picket fence, immaculate lawn that I mowed every Saturday morning, mortgage payments we knocked down ahead of schedule because we were both earning good money and wanted to prove we were responsible adults. I'm the service department manager at Premier Auto Group, the biggest dealership network in the Denver metro area. And Lauren runs human resources for Tech Vision Solutions, one of those IT companies that sprouted up like weeds after the tech boom. On paper, we look like winners. 2 good salaries, no kids to complicate things, a house that increased in value every quarter. But standing here now, looking at the professionally decorated interior that cost us 40 grand and somehow still feels sterile and cold, I realize we stopped being a couple about 8 months ago and just forgot to make it official. The signs were there if I'd bothered to look. Lauren started working late, 3-4 nights a week. Business trips to San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, always conveniently scheduled over weekends. She stopped asking about my day, stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped touching me unless it was absolutely necessary to maintain the illusion that we were still married. Our bedroom became a demilitarized zone where we each claimed our side of the king-size mattress and pretended the other person didn't exist. Sex became something that happened maybe once a month, mechanical and joyless, like we were both checking a box on some invisible marital to-do list. I told myself it was stress, that her job was demanding, that we'd get through this rough patch like we'd gotten through others. But deep down, in that place where you know the truth even when you're lying to yourself, I knew something had fundamentally shifted. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in late September. Nothing dramatic led up to it, no screaming fight or discovered evidence. I came home from work around 6:30, tired from dealing with an irate customer who'd somehow managed to blow his transmission after specifically ignoring every warning light on his dashboard for 3 months straight. Lauren was in the kitchen standing by the granite countertop we'd spent 2 weekends picking out because she wanted everything perfect. She was drinking white wine from one of our wedding crystal glasses, still wearing her work clothes, that sharp gray suit that made her look like she could fire someone without breaking stride. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She just took another sip of wine and said it. "Jack, I need you to understand something. I'm not sleeping with you anymore. I'm done with that part of our relationship. You need to deal with it." Not, "I think we should talk about our marriage," not, "I'm not happy," not even, "I want a divorce." Just a cold corporate announcement delivered in the same tone she probably used to tell employees they were being let go. No emotion, no room for discussion, no acknowledgement that she was essentially ending our marriage with one sentence. She expected me to argue, to beg, to ask what I'd done wrong. I could see it in the way she was standing, that slight tension in her shoulders like she was bracing for impact. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, feeling something click into place in my chest like a lock engaging. Then I nodded once, turned around, and walked upstairs to our bedroom. I heard her exhale behind me, probably in relief that I wasn't going to make a scene. I packed one bag with essentials, clothes for a week, toiletries, my laptop, the important documents I kept in my desk drawer. I took my car keys, my wallet, and the photo album from my parents that sat on my nightstand. I left the wedding photos, the vacation snapshots, all the carefully curated evidence of our supposedly happy life together. I placed my house keys on the dresser in the bedroom, walked back downstairs past Lauren, who was now sitting at the kitchen table looking vaguely surprised, and left through the front door without saying another word. I drove to my buddy Carson's place in Lakewood. We'd worked together at the dealership for 8 years before he moved to a competitor, and he'd always been the kind of friend who didn't ask stupid questions when you showed up at his door at 7 at night with everything you owned in a duffel bag. He took one look at my face, handed me a beer, and showed me to his guest room. That night, I didn't lie awake crying over my failed marriage or wondering where things went wrong. Instead, I sat at Carson's kitchen table with my laptop and methodically went through every joint account, every shared asset, every piece of financial information I had access to. I documented everything, made spreadsheets, took screenshots. By 3 in the morning, I had a complete picture of our financial situation, and I'd already transferred my personal savings to a separate account Lauren didn't have access to. I set spending limits on all our joint credit cards. I wasn't being emotional or vindictive. I was being practical. The next morning, I called Michael Reed. Everyone in Denver who's been through a nasty divorce knows Michael's name. He's the attorney you hire when you want to win, not when you want to be fair or amicable. His office is in downtown Denver, one of those intimidating glass towers where the hourly rates start at $500 and go up from there. I didn't care about the cost. This was an investment in my future, and unlike my marriage, it was one I knew would pay dividends. Michael's secretary got me an appointment for that afternoon, which told me everything I needed to know about how serious they took new clients who called sounding calm and determined rather than hysterical and desperate. Michael Reed looks exactly like you'd expect a successful divorce attorney to look. Mid-50s, perfectly tailored suit, gray hair that probably costs $200 to maintain, and eyes that have seen every dirty trick and desperate lie imaginable. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, gestured to the leather chair across from his massive desk, and asked me to tell him what brought me in. I laid it out in about 5 minutes, no emotional detours, just facts. Wife announced the physical part of our marriage was over. No discussion, no therapy suggestion, just a unilateral decision. I'd left the same night. We'd been married 10 years, together for 12. No kids, thank God. House in both names, joint accounts, the whole suburban dream package. Michael listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked the question that would change everything. Do you have a prenup? I did. Lauren and I had signed one before we got married, back when we were young and optimistic and thought we were being smart and practical. Her father had insisted on it, actually, because he'd been through a messy divorce himself and didn't trust anyone. At the time, Lauren had signed it without really reading the details because she was confident she'd always be the one in control, the one making more money, the one calling the shots. The prenup had standard provisions about division of assets, but it also had one particular clause that her father had insisted on, a clause that now seemed almost prophetic. If either party could prove infidelity, the cheating spouse forfeited their claim to most marital assets acquired during the marriage. At the time, we'd both laughed it off as unnecessary. We were in love. We'd never cheat. That kind of thing happened to other people, not us. Michael read through the prenup with the careful attention of a surgeon examining an X-ray. When he got to the infidelity clause, I saw the corner of his mouth twitch in what might have been a smile if he were the type to show emotion in front of clients. He looked up at me with those calculating gray eyes and asked the obvious follow-up question. Do you have any reason to believe your wife has been unfaithful? I didn't have proof yet, but I had suspicions that were rapidly hardening into certainty. The late nights, the weekend trips, the way she'd started dressing differently, paying more attention to her appearance, but less attention to me. The new habit of taking phone calls in another room. The password changes on her phone and laptop. The emotional distance that felt less like depression and more like someone whose attention had shifted to a different target. I told Michael I suspected but couldn't prove anything yet. He nodded slowly, steepled his fingers, and gave me the kind of advice that would make a marriage counselor have a stroke. Then I suggest you find proof before we file anything. If she's cheating and we can document it, this divorce will be quick, clean, and very much in your favor. If she's not, or if we can't prove it, things get messier and more expensive. Take some time, be smart. And whatever you do, don't confront her or tip your hand until we're ready to move. I left Michael's office with a retainer agreement, a strategy session scheduled for the following week, and a mission. I needed evidence, and I needed it fast before Lauren realized I wasn't coming back with my tail between my legs, begging for another chance. The beautiful thing about people who think they're smarter than everyone else is that they get careless. Lauren had always considered herself the intelligent one in our relationship. I was just the car dealership manager, the guy who dealt with mechanics and customers and inventory. She had the fancy corporate job, the big salary, the impressive title. She thought that made her superior, made her untouchable. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating people. I went back to the house 2 days later when I knew Lauren would be at work. I still had my keys. She hadn't bothered to change the locks yet, probably because she assumed I'd eventually come crawling back. The house felt different now, less like home and more like a crime scene I was investigating. I wasn't there to wallow in memories or second-guess my decision. I was there to gather intelligence. Lauren's old MacBook was still in the home office, the one she'd replaced 6 months ago with a newer model from work, but hadn't bothered to wipe because she'd simply shifted all her important files to the cloud and forgot the old machine existed. That kind of carelessness was exactly what I was counting on. The laptop still had her Apple ID logged in, which meant I had access to her iCloud account, her messages, her photos, everything she thought was private and secure. What I found in the next 2 hours would have been devastating if I'd still cared about our marriage. Email chains going back 8 months with someone named Evan Collins. Hotel reservations in Boulder, Breckenridge. Even a weekend in Aspen that she'd told me was a mandatory HR conference. Text messages that made it crystal clear this wasn't some emotional affair or one-time mistake. This was calculated, ongoing, and thoroughly documented thanks to Lauren's apparent belief that cloud storage was somehow anonymous and invisible. Evan Collins turned out to be a management consultant, one of those guys who gets paid obscene amounts of money to tell companies things they already know, but packaged in PowerPoint presentations with corporate buzzwords. 40 years old, divorced twice according to his social media presence, perpetually tan, and fit in that way that suggests either a personal trainer or an unhealthy obsession with CrossFit. His LinkedIn profile made him look like a success story. His text messages to my wife made him look like a manipulative creep who enjoyed the thrill of an affair but would vanish the moment things got complicated. Reading through their conversations was like watching a masterclass in mutual delusion. Lauren talked about me like I was some kind of convenient accessory, a wallet that paid the mortgage while she explored her true feelings. Evan played the role of understanding confidant, telling her she deserved to be happy, that she shouldn't settle, that real passion was worth any risk. The messages that hurt the most weren't even the sexual ones, though there were plenty of those. It was the casual contempt, the jokes at my expense, the way she described our marriage like it was a prison sentence she'd finally figured out how to escape. One message in particular stuck with me. Lauren had written to Evan after one of our rare attempts at intimacy, describing it as mechanical and depressing, like watching someone go through the motions of something they remember used to matter. Evan had responded with some garbage about how she discovered what real connection felt like and couldn't go back to pretending. Neither of them seemed to consider that maybe the reason our marriage had become mechanical was because she'd already checked out emotionally and was comparing me to her exciting new affair partner. I didn't let myself get emotional. I couldn't afford to. Instead, I methodically documented everything. Screenshots of every damning message, copies of hotel reservations, credit card statements showing charges at restaurants and boutique hotels that Lauren had claimed were work-related expenses. I backed everything up to 3 separate drives and a secure cloud account she didn't have access to. By the time I left the house that afternoon, I had enough evidence to prove infidelity beyond any reasonable doubt. I also had something more valuable than proof. I had a timeline that showed Lauren had been planning this affair for months, had lied repeatedly to my face, and had actively mocked me to her lover while still enjoying the financial security our marriage provided. Michael Reed reviewed my evidence during our next meeting and actually cracked a smile, something I got the impression didn't happen often in his line of work. He spread the printouts across his conference table like a poker player showing a royal flush and told me we had an airtight case. The prenup's infidelity clause would hold up in court, especially given the documented timeline and the way Lauren had essentially abandoned the marriage while continuing to benefit from our shared assets. Michael's advice was straightforward. Wait for the right moment, file the papers, and be prepared for Lauren to explode when she realized she'd been outmaneuvered. "She's going to accuse you of invasion of privacy," Michael warned. She'll say you had no right to access her messages or documents. But here's the thing, that laptop was in your shared home, and Colorado has specific laws about marital property and reasonable expectation of privacy. Plus, the prenup has a clause about full disclosure of assets and activities that could affect the marriage. The moment she started lying about her whereabouts and using joint funds to finance her affair, she violated that clause. We're on solid legal ground. I asked Michael how he wanted to proceed. He suggested we give it another week or two, let Lauren think she'd gotten away with her Declaration of Independence, and that I was too weak or too conflicted to do anything about it. People make their biggest mistakes when they think they've won, when they let their guard down and start acting like consequences don't exist. I trusted Michael's instincts. He'd been doing this for 25 years and had a win rate that other attorneys could only dream about. If he said wait, I'd wait. Lauren called me 4 days later, not to apologize or suggest counseling, but to propose what she called a mature arrangement. She wanted to meet for coffee at a place in downtown Denver, neutral territory where we could talk like adults about our situation. I agreed immediately, keeping my voice calm and neutral, giving her no indication that I was playing a completely different game than she thought we were playing. When I showed up at the coffee shop, Lauren was already there, looking polished and confident in one of her power suits, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall like she was conducting a business negotiation. She started with pleasantries, asking how I was doing, where I was staying, whether I was managing okay without her. I gave vague responses, played the part of the confused husband who wasn't quite sure how to handle this new reality. That seemed to relax her. She leaned back in her chair, took a sip of her latte, and laid out her vision for our future. She wanted what she called an open marriage. We'd stay legally married for tax and insurance benefits, continue to co-own the house, present a united front to our friends and families, but we'd each have the freedom to pursue other relationships, to explore our needs, to live authentic lives without the constraints of traditional monogamy. The audacity of it was almost impressive. She wanted to keep all the benefits of being married to me, my income, the house, the social respectability, while having complete freedom to continue her affair with Evan or anyone else she chose. And she presented this as though it were some kind of progressive, enlightened arrangement that we should both celebrate. She talked about emotional maturity and honest communication and respecting each other's boundaries. She never once acknowledged that she'd already been doing exactly what she wanted without my knowledge or consent. She never apologized for the lies or the betrayal or the months of treating me like an inconvenient roommate. She just sat there, confident and articulate, explaining why I should be grateful for her honesty and embrace this new chapter in our relationship. I listened to the whole pitch without interrupting. I nodded occasionally, asked a few clarifying questions, even threw in some thoughtful pauses like I was seriously considering her proposal. When she finished, I told her I needed some time to think about it, that it was a big decision, and I wanted to be sure I was approaching it rationally rather than emotionally. That was exactly what she wanted to hear. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, told me she was proud of how mature I was being, how she'd been worried I'd react badly, but I was proving to be more evolved than she'd given me credit for. I let her have that moment of triumph. I even managed a sad little smile that suggested I was struggling, but trying to be supportive. She left that coffee shop thinking she'd won, thinking she'd successfully maneuvered me into accepting a situation where she got everything she wanted and I got to be the understanding, accommodating husband who stood aside while she lived her best life. What she didn't know was that Michael Reed had the divorce papers ready to file, that we had a strategy mapped out down to the smallest detail, and that her smug confidence was about to cost her everything she thought she'd so cleverly secured. Michael and I chose our moment carefully. Lauren had a big presentation at work, a quarterly review where she'd be pitching a new HR initiative to the executive team and several board members. Michael arranged for a process server to deliver the divorce papers to her office at exactly 10:30 in the morning, right when she'd be in the middle of her presentation. It was calculated, brutal, and exactly what she deserved. The papers included copies of the text messages, the hotel reservations, the timeline of her affair, and a clear invocation of the prenup's infidelity clause. We weren't asking for a divorce. We were ending her fairy tale with a legal sledgehammer. According to the process server's report, which Michael insisted on getting because he enjoyed thoroughness, Lauren's face went white when she realized what she was being handed. She tried to maintain composure, told the room she needed 5 minutes, and left her own presentation to read through the documents in the hallway. The process server waited to confirm she'd understood what she'd received, then left while Lauren was still standing there, papers shaking in her hands. Within an hour, I had 3 missed calls from her, then 5, then a string of increasingly frantic text messages that went from confused to angry to desperate in the span of 30 minutes. I didn't respond to any of them. Michael had been clear. No contact, no explanations, no engagement whatsoever. Every word I said to her at this point could be used in court, and we'd already said everything we needed to say through legal documents. Let her panic. Let her call Evan and realize he wasn't going to ride to her rescue. Let her understand that actions have consequences and that treating people like disposable accessories comes with a price tag. She showed up at Carson's place that night. I don't know how she found out I was staying there. Probably called everyone we both knew until someone slipped up. But she was at the door at 9 o'clock, looking nothing like the composed HR executive who'd pitched her open marriage proposal a week earlier. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was a mess, and she had that desperate energy of someone who just realized they'd miscalculated badly. Carson answered the door, took one look at her, and called out to me without letting her inside. I came to the doorway, but didn't invite her in. Jack, we need to talk. This is insane. You can't just serve me divorce papers at work in front of my colleagues. Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation? The irony of her worrying about reputation while facing evidence of an 8-month affair wasn't lost on me, but I kept my expression neutral. She tried everything in her emotional manipulation playbook. First came anger. How dare I humiliate her? I'd regret this. I was being vindictive and cruel. When that didn't work, she switched to tears, explaining that the affair didn't mean anything, that she still cared about me, that we could work through this if I'd just give her a chance. When I still didn't respond, she shifted to bargaining, offering to end things with Evan immediately, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to make this right. I let her run through all the stages of panic and denial. Then I pulled out my phone and showed her the printouts I'd brought with me, screenshots of her messages to Evan, particularly the ones where she'd called our marriage a convenient fiction and referred to me as a reliable source of financial stability while she explored her real feelings elsewhere. I watched her face change as she read her own words, watched the defenses crumble as she realized I hadn't just discovered the affair. I'd documented it meticulously, and there was no way to argue or explain her way out of what she'd written in her own hand. You wanted me to deal with you not sleeping with me anymore, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I dealt with it. You wanted freedom and honesty. Now you have both. The prenup you signed is very clear about what happens when one partner commits infidelity. You made your choices, Lauren. Now you get to live with the consequences. She tried to argue that accessing her messages was illegal, that I'd invaded her privacy, that nothing I'd found would hold up in court. I told her she could discuss all of that with her own attorney, and that any further communication between us needed to go through our respective legal representatives. Then I stepped back inside Carson's house and closed the door. I could hear her standing on the other side for maybe a minute, probably trying to decide whether to knock again or leave. Eventually, I heard her footsteps walking away and a car starting in the driveway. Carson handed me another beer and asked if I was okay. The honest answer was that I didn't know. I wasn't heartbroken. That would have required me to still love the person Lauren had revealed herself to be, and I couldn't love someone who treated me with such casual contempt. I wasn't angry either, at least not in the hot, immediate way that makes you want to break things or yell. What I felt was something colder and more permanent. I felt done, like I'd closed a book I'd been reading for 10 years and realized the ending wasn't what I'd hoped for, but at least it was over. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, document filing, and strategic positioning. Michael moved fast, using the evidence we'd gathered to establish that Lauren had not only violated the prenup's infidelity clause, but had done so while actively deceiving me about her whereabouts and using joint marital funds to finance her affair. Every hotel room, every dinner, Every weekend getaway with Evan had been charged to our shared credit cards or covered by withdrawals from our joint accounts. That meant she hadn't just cheated. She'd stolen from the marriage to fund her deception. Michael structured the filing to make it clear that this wasn't a case of two people growing apart. This was a case of one partner systematically betraying and exploiting the other. Lauren hired her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Gaines, who had a reputation for being aggressive in representing female clients in divorce cases. Patricia tried several angles to challenge our position. She argued that I'd violated Lauren's privacy by accessing her messages, that the prenup was outdated and should be reconsidered, that Lauren deserved an equitable split of marital assets regardless of the infidelity clause because she'd contributed equally to the marriage. Michael demolished each argument with the kind of calm precision that made his hourly rate seem like a bargain. The laptop I'd accessed was jointly owned marital property in a shared home. The prenup had been signed by both parties with full legal representation present and was ironclad. And Lauren's contributions to the marriage didn't override the clear language of a contract she'd voluntarily entered into. The real turning point came when Patricia tried to bring Evan into the proceedings, hoping he could somehow provide testimony that would paint Lauren's affair in a more sympathetic light. Michael was practically gleeful about this development. He'd already had investigators look into Evan Collins and found exactly what you'd expect from a 40-year-old management consultant with 2 failed marriages and a pattern of relationships with married women. Evan wanted nothing to do with Lauren's divorce. The moment he realized he might have to testify or be publicly associated with breaking up a marriage, he disappeared faster than a consultant when the project budget runs out. Deleted his social media, changed his phone number, probably moved on to his next target who didn't come with messy legal complications. Lauren, to her credit or perhaps her stubborn inability to accept reality, tried to maintain her dignity throughout the process. She showed up to hearings dressed impeccably, spoke calmly when required to address the court, and generally tried to project an image of a rational professional woman who'd made some mistakes but deserved to be treated fairly. The problem was that the evidence didn't support the narrative she was trying to sell. Text messages don't lie. Hotel receipts don't lie. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners and weekend getaways don't lie. And a prenup signed with full legal counsel present doesn't go away just because it becomes inconvenient. The final hearing was set for mid-December, just before the holidays. Both attorneys presented their cases, though it was more of a formality at that point than an actual contest. The judge, a woman in her 60s, who'd probably seen every variation of marital dysfunction imaginable, reviewed the evidence with the kind of weary efficiency that suggested she'd already made up her mind, but was going through the motions for the record. When she delivered her ruling, it was exactly what Michael had predicted. The prenup would be enforced. Lauren's infidelity had been established beyond reasonable doubt. The house in Greenwood, which I'd financed primarily through my income, and which had been titled jointly only because we'd been married at the time of purchase, would be awarded to me. The majority of our joint assets, including savings and investments, would be split according to the prenup's provisions, which heavily favored the non-cheating spouse. Lauren would receive a small settlement covering her initial contributions to the down payment and some shared expenses, but nothing close to the 50-50 split she'd been hoping for. Lauren sat perfectly still as the judge read the verdict, her attorney beside her scribbling notes that probably boiled down to, "We lost completely." I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt tired and strangely hollow, like I'd won a battle that shouldn't have had to be fought in the first place. When the judge dismissed us, Lauren walked out of the courtroom without looking at me, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a kind of sharp, angry rhythm that suggested she was barely holding it together. Patricia Gaines gave Michael a curt nod that acknowledged his victory, and that was it. 10 years of marriage, 8 months of betrayal, 6 weeks of legal warfare, all wrapped up in a 15-minute hearing and a judge's signature. I sold the house in Greenwood 3 weeks later. I couldn't stand being there anymore. Every room reminded me of a version of my life that had turned out to be an illusion, a carefully staged performance where I'd been the only actor who didn't know it was fake. A young couple bought it, both engineers at an aerospace company, excitedly talking about starting a family and building their future. I wished them luck and tried not to think about how naive I'd been when Lauren and I had done the same thing 6 years earlier. The realtor got me a good price, well above what we'd paid for it, thanks to the Denver housing market's continued insanity. I took the proceeds, paid off the remaining mortgage, and started looking for something different. Boulder seemed like the right choice. Close enough to Denver that I could keep my job at the dealership. They'd been understanding about my situation and had even hinted that a promotion might be in the works. But far enough away that I wouldn't run into Lauren at every grocery store or coffee shop. I found a smaller place, a townhouse with mountain views that felt more like a home than our showcase house in Greenwood ever had. No white picket fence, no immaculate lawn that required constant maintenance. Just a simple, clean space where I could figure out who I was without the weight of a failed marriage crushing me. The divorce was finalized in January, right after New Year's. There was no ceremony, no dramatic final confrontation, just an email from Michael's office with the signed documents and a brief note saying I was officially a free man. I took myself out to dinner that night, nothing fancy, just a decent steakhouse in Boulder where nobody knew my story or cared about my past. I ordered a good bourbon, ate my meal slowly, and tried to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Relief seemed too simple. Happiness felt premature. Sadness would have been appropriate, except I didn't actually miss Lauren, not the person she'd turned out to be. What I missed was the idea of her, the potential of us, the future I'd imagined that had evaporated like morning fog. Lauren tried to contact me one more time in February. I was settled into the Boulder place, had started hiking on weekends to clear my head, was generally finding a rhythm that didn't involve constantly analyzing where my marriage had gone wrong. My new number was unlisted, but she found me through social media with a message that was either desperate or manipulative, depending on how generous you wanted to be with your interpretation. She said she'd made terrible mistakes, that she understood now what she'd thrown away, that maybe we could talk about starting over or at least finding closure. She looked different in her profile picture, tired, older somehow, like the past few months had aged her in ways that expensive skincare couldn't fix. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely, to let the silence be my final answer. But another part of me, the part that had spent 10 years with this woman and had once genuinely believed we'd grow old together, felt like she deserved some kind of closure, even if I didn't owe it to her. I suggested we meet for coffee, same neutral territory approach she'd used when proposing her open marriage fantasy. This time, though, I was the one setting the terms. She showed up looking fragile in a way I'd never seen before. Lauren had always been composed, always in control, always projecting confidence even when things were falling apart. But the woman who sat across from me in that Boulder coffee shop looked defeated. She'd lost weight, her clothes didn't fit quite right, and there was something brittle in her eyes that suggested she'd learned some hard lessons and was still processing the cost. She started to apologize, to explain, to offer justifications for her behavior. I let her talk for a few minutes, then raised my hand to stop her. Lauren, I'm going to say this once, and then we're done. What you did wasn't about passion or finding yourself or needing emotional fulfillment. You took the easy, selfish path. You wanted the security of our marriage and the excitement of an affair, and you convinced yourself you deserved both. You treated me like a convenience, like a wallet and a safety net, and you mocked me to your lover while still cashing the checks our partnership provided. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. And when I found out and held you accountable, you didn't feel genuine remorse. You felt angry that you got caught and had to face consequences. She tried to interrupt, to argue that she'd changed, that she understood what she'd lost. I kept going. The divorce is final. The house is sold. Our life together is over. You wanted freedom. You wanted to be authentic and live without constraints. Congratulations. You got exactly what you asked for. The difference is that now you have to do it without my support, without my income, without the comfortable suburban existence you took for granted while you were busy destroying it. I hope it was worth it. I hope Evan was everything you thought he'd be. And I hope you learned something from this before you hurt someone else the way you hurt me. She was crying by the time I finished, mascara running down her face in those black streaks that would have been tragic if I'd still cared enough to find them meaningful. She asked if there was any chance for us, any possibility of rebuilding what we'd had. I told her the truth. There was nothing to rebuild. The foundation had been rotten, and we'd both been too stubborn or too scared to admit it until the whole structure came crashing down. The marriage we'd had wasn't worth saving, and the people we'd become during the collapse weren't compatible anymore. I wasn't angry with her. I wasn't even disappointed. I was just done. I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back. I heard she moved to California a few months later, took a job with a tech startup in San Francisco, started over in a city where nobody knew her story. I heard she posted inspirational quotes about growth and learning from mistakes on social media, the kind of performative self-awareness that suggests someone who's rebranded their past rather than genuinely coming to terms with it. I heard that Evan Collins got engaged to someone else, another woman from another affair, and that Lauren had a small breakdown when she found out. I heard all of this secondhand through mutual acquaintances who didn't understand that I'd moved past giving a damn about her drama. My own life got better in small, incremental ways that added up to something significant. I got the promotion at work, took over as the general manager of the entire dealership group, and started earning the kind of money that made the divorce settlement look like a wise investment. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected during my marriage, made new ones through hiking groups and community events. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, just dinner and conversation with women who were interesting and didn't come with the baggage of betrayal. I learned to be alone without being lonely, learned that marriage wasn't the destination I'd been taught to believe it was, learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away from something broken rather than waste years trying to fix it. A year after the divorce, I was standing on a trail outside Boulder, looking at the mountains at sunset, thinking about how different my life had turned out from what I'd imagined. The American dream I'd been chasing, the perfect house, the stable marriage, the illusion of permanence, had revealed itself to be exactly that, an illusion. But the view from this trail, the clean air, the sense of being exactly where I was supposed to be without having to perform for anyone or pretend everything was fine, that felt more real than anything I'd experienced in the last few years of my marriage. I'd lost a wife, a house, and 10 years of my life to a relationship that had been dying long before either of us had the courage to admit it. But I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I could survive betrayal, face the consequences, and come out the other side stronger and clearer about what actually mattered. Lauren had wanted freedom. She'd wanted to be authentic, to live without constraints, to explore her needs without judgment. She got all of that, just not in the way she'd imagined. She got the freedom that comes from burning down your life and having to rebuild from scratch. She got the authenticity of facing consequences without the safety net of a partner who'd tolerated her selfishness for too long. She got to explore her needs while learning that excitement fades and affair partners disappear when things get difficult and real life intrudes on fantasy. I got something better. I got clarity. I got self-respect. I got the knowledge that I'd handled a terrible situation with dignity and strength, that I hadn't begged or compromised or accepted less than I deserved. I got a life that belonged to me, shaped by my choices rather than someone else's betrayal. And I got the understanding that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is let go of what you thought you wanted in order to make room for what you actually need. The house in Greenwood was gone, sold to a couple with dreams that might work out better than mine had. The marriage that was supposed to last forever had lasted just long enough to teach me what I didn't want. The woman I'd thought I'd spend my life with had revealed herself to be someone I barely recognized and certainly didn't miss. But the mountains were still there. The trails were still waiting. And the life I was building, brick by brick and day by day, was finally, genuinely mine. Standing there on that boulder trail, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of orange and red, I realized I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was just free. Free from the weight of a dying marriage, free from the obligation to fix something that had been broken from the inside out, free from the exhausting performance of pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. Lauren had given me an accidental gift with her declaration that night in our Greenwood kitchen. She'd forced me to face the truth I'd been avoiding, to take action instead of drowning in hope, to choose myself over a relationship that had stopped serving either of us years ago. The divorce had cost me money, time, and a chunk of my faith in relationships. but it had given me back something more valuable. My life, my agency, my ability to walk away from situations that diminished me. I'd learned that strength isn't staying in a bad situation because you're too scared or too proud to admit defeat. Strength is recognizing when something is over, cutting your losses, and building something better from the pieces that remain. I'd learned that love without respect is just codependency with better marketing. And I'd learned that sometimes the person you're trying to save from their own bad decisions is actually the person you need to save yourself from. Lauren was somewhere in California now, probably telling her version of our story to new friends who didn't know the parts she'd leave out. The infidelity, the manipulation, the cold calculation behind her decision to keep me as financial support while exploring her authentic feelings elsewhere. In her version, I was probably the controlling husband who couldn't handle her growth, the rigid man who'd refused to evolve with her, the one who'd weaponized a prenup instead of forgiving her human mistakes. And maybe some people would believe that version. People believe what they want to believe, shape narratives to confirm their existing worldview, give benefit of doubt to whoever tells the most compelling story. I didn't care anymore. Her narrative didn't change the facts. The text messages where she'd mocked me to her lover, the hotel receipts charged to our joint accounts, the 8 months of systematic deception while she enjoyed the security of our marriage and the excitement of her affair, the cold corporate delivery of her decision to end our physical relationship without discussion or compromise, the attempted manipulation when I'd refused to play the role of the understanding doormat she'd expected. Facts didn't care about narrative, and neither did prenuptial agreements or judges who'd seen this story play out 100 times before. I started my truck and drove back down the mountain as twilight settled over Boulder. Tomorrow I'd go to work, manage the dealership, deal with customers and mechanics, and the endless logistics of keeping a business running smoothly. The day after that, I might hit the trails again, or catch up with friends, or just sit on my deck reading a book without anyone demanding emotional labor, or making me feel guilty for wanting basic honesty and respect. Life had gotten simpler, smaller in some ways but bigger in others, less performative, more genuine, less about meeting expectations and more about figuring out what actually made me content. The American dream I'd been sold, the house, the marriage, the carefully curated social media presence showing a perfect life, had turned out to be a trap. Not because those things were inherently bad, but because I'd pursued them without asking whether they actually aligned with what I wanted or needed. I'd followed the script because that's what you were supposed to do. Meet someone, fall in love, get married, buy a house, project success to the world. Nobody tells you what happens when the person you chose reveals themselves to be different than who you thought they were. Nobody prepares you for the slow death of a relationship that looks perfect on the outside, but feels hollow on the inside. Nobody warns you that sometimes the right decision feels like failure because it doesn't match the narrative you've been building for a decade. But here's what I learned. Failure isn't ending something that isn't working. Failure is staying in something that's killing you because you're too afraid or too proud to admit you made a mistake. Failure is tolerating betrayal because you've invested too much time to walk away. Failure is accepting less than you deserve because the alternative requires courage and uncertainty. I hadn't failed. I'd survived, and now I was doing something even better. I was living. Lauren could keep California and her inspirational quotes and her carefully edited social media presence. She could keep Evan or the next Evan or whoever else she convinced herself was her true soulmate until the pattern repeated and the thrill faded, and she was left with the same emptiness she'd tried to fill with our marriage. She could keep her version of events and her justifications and her belief that she'd been the victim in a relationship that had simply run its course. None of it mattered anymore because I'd taken back the one thing that truly belonged to me, my future. The mountains were still there when I woke up the next morning. The sun still rose over Boulder, painting the sky in those impossible colors that made you believe in fresh starts and second chances. My coffee still tasted good. My life, stripped down to its essentials and rebuilt from scratch, still felt like mine in a way it hadn't for years. And somewhere in Colorado, in a townhouse with mountain views and no ghosts, I was finally completely free.